The hum of the furnace was the only sound that night. Low, steady, mechanical, a heartbeat for a place meant to hold none. It was past midnight at St. Helena Memorial Crematorium, and the world outside had gone completely still. Inside, the air was heavy with disinfectant and heat. I remember thinking it felt cleaner than most hospitals, but emptier too, like the building itself had stopped breathing. That night was my first solo shift. After months of shadowing others, I was finally trusted to handle everything on my own. The paperwork, the preparation, the ignition, routine steps, all of them. Nothing I hadn't seen before. And yet, something in the air felt wrong the moment the doors closed behind me. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was awareness, as if I had stepped into a space where the rules of sound and silence no longer applied. I moved through the checklist like a machine. Body logs, chamber calibration, vent flow test. Each task was meant to keep me grounded, but the hum beneath the floor grew louder, almost like it was pushing back. I remember glancing at the clock, 12:43 a.m. The minute hand barely moved, but time already felt strange. I opened the cooler room to retrieve the first body of the night. The tag read, Michael Harris, 42, cardiac arrest. A name like any other, printed in black ink. I wheeled the stretcher out, the squeak of the wheels echoing far too loudly against the tile. I told myself to breathe. You get used to it, they said. You stop seeing a person and start seeing a process. But that's a lie. You never stop seeing the person. Everything about the job is designed to feel methodical, detached, a way to make sense of what no one really understands. But as I slid the chamber door open, a sudden clang broke the quiet. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to freeze me in place. I turned, scanning the shadows, listening for movement. Nothing, just the faint whir of the ventilation fans. Then came the sound, soft, deliberate, impossible. 3 knocks, from behind the metal door. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the pipes or the creak of settling steel. But no, the sound was too focused, too human. My throat went dry. I stepped closer, pressing my ear to the cold metal. Silence. Then another knock. Slower this time, as if someone were answering my heartbeat. I told myself what every technician tells themselves the first time they get spooked. It's pressure. It's gas. It's nothing. But deep down, I knew the difference. It wasn't coming from the machinery. It was coming from the chamber. The protocol said to check for leaks to ensure no movement of air. My hands trembled as I opened the viewing hatch. The inside was empty, motionless. The body on the stretcher hadn't even been moved yet. The rational part of me tried to laugh it off, to dismiss it as nerves, but the other part, the part I couldn't quiet, whispered that maybe silence wasn't as silent as we think. I stood there for what felt like forever, listening to nothing and everything at once. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, pale, uncertain, breathing where others could not. And in that fragile moment between logic and dread, I realized something had shifted in the room, in me, in the air itself. And then the knocking stopped. Before that night, I never thought of death as something mysterious. I thought of it as a process. Clinical, contained, predictable. That's what drew me to the crematorium in the first place. I used to be a nurse. Spent 6 years in the cardiac ward at St. Helena Hospital, running codes, watching lives come and go like tides. You learn to detach, to survive the constant rhythm of heart monitors and loss. But when the layoffs came and the hospital downsized, I found myself in a place where the heart no longer mattered. St. Helena Memorial Crematorium was quiet in ways hospitals never were. No alarms, no shouting, no race against time. Just order and finality. It felt like the aftermath of everything I used to fight against. The other side of the finish line. My supervisor, an older man named Ray, taught me early on that our work wasn't morbid. It was sacred. We don't burn bodies, he'd say. We return them. I believed him. Every shift followed the same rhythm. You clock in, check the ledger, verify identification tags, clean the tools, prep the chamber. You work alone most nights, surrounded by the faint smell of antiseptic and heat. There's comfort in the repetition, the same way there's comfort in a steady pulse. For months, that routine kept me grounded. The silence became familiar, almost kind. And then there's the unspoken rule among crematorium workers. Never look too long at the faces. It's not disrespect, it's protection. You start to see yourself in them, and that's dangerous. Still, sometimes I couldn't help it. There's something about that stillness, about the way every line, every scar, every feature tells a story that doesn't get recorded on any chart. That evening, when the final delivery came in, I was tired but calm. Everything about the night seemed ordinary. Paperwork in order, machinery running smoothly, the faint buzz of the security lights overhead. I remember thinking it might even be an easy shift, but when I unzipped the last bag, I hesitated. The man inside, Michael Harris, looked peaceful in a way that unsettled me. His expression wasn't slack or strained like most I'd seen. It was thoughtful, as if he'd fallen asleep mid-conversation. And his eyes, just barely open, catching the light. I logged the name, the tag number, the time, 12:47 a.m. I checked the temperature gauges. I wrote down the serial code of the chamber. Routine, always routine. But something in the back of my mind kept circling that face, that half-open gaze. I brushed it off as exhaustion, the way you learn to ignore small things when surrounded by so much finality. Still, as I rolled him toward the furnace, the thought lingered. Everything about that night looked ordinary, except the man on table 3. The van arrived just before midnight, its headlights cutting through the mist that hung low over the parking lot. I remember hearing the gravel crunch under the tires before I saw it. The driver, a young man from the hospital transport service, looked exhausted, half asleep behind the wheel. He handed me the paperwork with a weary nod, barely speaking. Transfers at that hour weren't unusual, but something about this one felt heavier. The name on the form read Michael Harris. Male, 42, cardiac arrest, pronounced 11:18 p.m. Everything looked standard. The bag was sealed, the tag intact, vitals confirmed. I signed the intake log, thanked the driver, and watched him disappear into the fog. That was the last time I saw another person that night. Inside, the building hummed softly, alive with machines, but devoid of life. I wheeled the stretcher into the prep bay. The fluorescent lights flickered as I unzipped the bag. Slow, deliberate, the sound stretching longer than it should have. His face appeared calm and expressionless, but there was something about his eyes. They weren't fully closed. The pupils had clouded, yes, the way they always do. Yet the lids hovered open, just enough to catch a reflection of the overhead lights. It made him look aware, like someone listening. I tried to shake it off. Muscle relaxation, I muttered. Completely normal. I checked his wrists. The IV marks were clean, no signs of trauma. His chest bore faint residue from defibrillator pads. I could almost hear the faint echo of the hospital room, the rush of staff, the sound of paddles charging. Clear? Then silence. That silence, I thought, now lived here. Following protocol, I attached the identification tag to his toe, logged the entry time, 12:47 a.m., and double-checked the paperwork. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. The air. Pressure shifted, a subtle pulse through the metal floor. I remember thinking the weather matched the moment, charged, waiting. As I moved the stretcher toward the chamber, the lights flickered again, this time longer. I paused, waiting for them to steady. That's when I heard it. A faint exhale. I froze. My hands hovered midair. For a split second, the sound was so natural, so human, that my brain filled in the rest. The rise of a chest, the pull of breath. I leaned closer, listening. Nothing. I waited, heart pounding in my ears. Air release, I told myself. It happens. Just gases. Every crematorium worker learns early on that bodies can make sounds, sighs, murmurs, the soft escape of air through the throat. You rationalize it because you must, but then came something else. A whisper. Too soft to be certain, too deliberate to be mistaken. It lasted only a second, a breath shaped into sound. I couldn't tell if it was a word, but my mind swore it was. My body went cold. I checked his pulse, his pupils, his skin. No warmth, no movement. Nothing that belonged to the living. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, waiting for something to make sense, a logical thread to pull. But there was none. Just the storm building outside and the echo of that sound. Trapped somewhere between my ears and the chamber walls. Whatever it wasn't over yet. The storm outside had fully broken by the time I began the process. Thunder rolled so close it shook the metal vents overhead, and the fluorescent lights flickered in a nervous rhythm. I tried to keep my hands steady, focusing on the dials, the gauges, the temperature readouts, anything but the body lying before me. Every motion was muscle memory. Align the tray, check the door seal, adjust the burn rate. Routine, always routine. But my heart wouldn't listen. It was racing, pounding against my ribs like it was trying to warn me of something. When the chamber door sealed shut, the silence returned. Thick, humming, alive. I told myself the whisper I'd heard was just air, that the mind can play tricks when exhaustion meets isolation. I had to believe that. There's no room for imagination in a place built on precision. The ignition key turned with a soft click. A low roar filled the space, the sound of the burners coming to life. The heat lamps glowed orange through the inspection window. Everything proceeded as expected. I watched the temperature climb, 300, 400, 500 degrees. The smell of warm metal filled the air. Then, amid the mechanical noise, I heard it again, a whisper. Louder this time. It wasn't a word, not at first, just the shape of breath pressed against the roar of fire. I froze, eyes fixed on the small window in the chamber door. My mind screamed that it was impossible, that sound can't form from a body that no longer breathes. But impossibility has a strange way of unraveling in silence. And then came the knocking. At first, it was faint, irregular, like expansion noises from the steel walls. But within seconds, it found rhythm. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. Deliberate, patterned. My stomach dropped. I felt sweat break across my neck despite the cold air. I hit the emergency stop switch, my hand trembling. The burners cut off instantly, leaving only the whine of cooling metal. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I called out, barely above a whisper myself. Is someone here? My voice sounded foreign in the empty room. No answer. I stepped closer to the door, my breath fogging the glass of the inspection window. And then, movement. A flicker of shadow, small but unmistakable. My chest tightened. It wasn't just heat distortion. It was distinct. I could have sworn I saw a hand. Fingers pressed flat against the glass, sliding down slowly until they disappeared from view. My first thought was madness. My second was guilt. What if he hadn't been gone? The medical files, the certification, everything said otherwise. But my training as a nurse clawed its way back through the fear. I had seen miracles before, impossible moments when patients came back after minutes of stillness. What if this was one of them? I grabbed my phone and dialed Ray, my supervisor. No answer. I called again. Nothing. Just static in the low hum of the building. Alone, I turned back to the window. The movement had stopped. The chamber was still. Part of me wanted to open it, to confirm what my senses screamed. The other part knew how insane that would look in the morning. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, caught between two worlds. The one ruled by science, and the one ruled by something far older. In the end, I did what fear makes all of us do. Nothing. I stood there, listening to the silence that had once felt safe, now filled with something unseen. And in that stillness, I whispered to no one, please, let it be over. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. By the time Ray arrived, dawn was creeping in through the high, frosted windows. The storm had passed, leaving the air heavy and still. I must have looked pale. He noticed immediately. Rough night? He asked, forcing a small grin. I didn't answer. I couldn't find words that didn't sound insane. He walked to the chamber, checked the gauges, and reviewed the data. Everything looked normal. The temperature readings were consistent, the oxygen flow stable, the logs uninterrupted. No sign of a malfunction. He flipped through the checklist, then looked at me. Everything's clean, he said. You shut it down early, though. Why? I hesitated. The truth hung on the edge of my tongue, too heavy to say out loud. What could I possibly tell him? That I'd heard a man whisper inside the furnace? That I'd seen a hand press against glass at 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit? He'd think I'd lost my mind. I thought I saw smoke backflow. I lied. Didn't want to risk it. He nodded, half listening, already moving on. Good call. Better safe than sorry. He reset the switches and signed off the logs like nothing had happened. But I stayed behind, staring at that chamber at the faint smear on the inside of the glass that I knew hadn't been there before. After Ray left, I pulled Michael Harris's file again. I needed something. A thread of logic, an explanation to hold on to. The documentation was meticulous. Time of death confirmed by 2 physicians. ECG attached, notes from the code team. Everything was textbook. Except one thing. The last ECG line didn't end cleanly. There was a faint blip, residual electrical activity. It was likely artifact, static from the monitor. That's what I told myself. But part of me couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't static. Maybe it was the smallest flicker of something we still don't understand. Something that lingers in the space between the final beat and complete silence. For days, I replayed that night in my head. The knock, the whisper, the hand. My rational mind dissected it, looking for cracks. Fatigue, stress, suggestion. I lined up every excuse, but none fit. It didn't feel like hallucination. It felt observed. At home, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that faint movement behind the glass. I could hear the whisper again. Soft, deliberate. Maybe it wasn't even sound. Maybe it was something I wasn't meant to understand. By the end of the week, I stopped trying to explain it. I just carried it. The memory, the guilt, the question. What if I'd been wrong? What if, for a moment, the line between life and death wasn't as clear as we wanted it to be? It haunted me, not as a nightmare, but as a truth I could never prove. In the weeks that followed, I became obsessed with finding an answer. Not because I wanted to believe in something supernatural, but because I needed to believe in something rational. I couldn't move on until the event had a name, a reason, a line in a textbook somewhere that made sense of what I saw. I started digging into research papers, old medical journals, case studies. There were rare mentions of something called the Lazarus phenomenon, spontaneous return of circulation after failed resuscitation. In some documented cases, patients had been declared dead for up to 10 minutes before showing signs of life. I remembered the faint electrical blip on Michael Harris's ECG and felt my stomach twist. Could it have been one of those? Could I have witnessed that? I reached out to an old colleague from my nursing days, Dr. Lauren Mitchell. She worked in the ER at St. Helena and had seen more resuscitations than anyone I knew. I didn't tell her everything at first, just that I'd experienced something strange during a cremation process. She laughed softly. You always did attract the weird ones, Ethan. But when I showed her the ECG, her face changed. That's not artifact, she said quietly, tracing the faint line with her finger. That's organized electrical activity. Not strong enough to perfuse, but it's something. Could that mean... I hesitated, she sighed. It means sometimes death isn't as immediate as we think. Cells fire. Nerves react. The heart flutters before surrendering for good. But consciousness? She shook her head. No one really knows what happens then. Her words lingered longer than I wanted them to. No one really knows. That's what medicine never says out loud. That there are edges to what we understand, soft zones where science stops and mystery begins. I told her, finally, about the whisper, about the knock, about what I thought I saw behind the glass. I expected disbelief, maybe even pity. But she just looked at me, her eyes soft, searching. You're not the first to hear something you can't explain, she said. Maybe it wasn't a voice. Maybe it was your conscience, or memory, or just noise finding shape in grief. I wanted to agree. I wanted it to be that simple. But deep down, I knew what I heard. It wasn't random. It wasn't static. It was a word, clear enough that I can still hear it now, years later. It said, wait, just that. A plea, a command, a moment of awareness from the edge of the unknowable. For days after, I replayed that single syllable in my mind. What if it wasn't meant for me? What if it was a fragment of someone else's final thought, echoing in a body that hadn't quite let go? Lauren told me to take time off, to rest, to stop thinking about it. But how do you rest when you've glimpsed something that defies everything you've ever trusted? When science, your anchor, suddenly feels small? Maybe, I thought, the silence after death isn't silence at all. Maybe it's just the last thing we can't yet hear. It's been 6 years since that night, and I still think about it. Not every day, but often enough that it lingers in the quiet moments. I left the crematorium a few months later. Ray said it was burnout. Maybe he was right. But truthfully, I couldn't stand the silence anymore. It wasn't empty to me after that night. It was alive, listening. Now I work at a hospice on the edge of town. It's different here, gentler somehow. My hands still guide the dying, but in a way that feels human again. I sit beside families, help them breathe through grief, help patients cross that invisible line with dignity. And every time I hold a hand that's cooling, every time I watch that final exhale fade into stillness, I remember him. Michael Harris, the man who, for a moment, seemed to refuse the silence. Sometimes I tell myself I imagined everything. That stress and fatigue can warp memory, twist fear into something tangible. But then there are moments, fleeting, weightless, when a patient's breathing slows and their eyes fix on something unseen, and I hear that same faint whisper in my mind. Not from them, not from the room, but from somewhere deeper. Wait. I've come to realize that what haunts me isn't the fear of what happened that night. It's the humility of it. The reminder that all the science, all the charts and procedures, all our certainty about when life ends, might not be absolute. We define death by heartbeat, by pulse, by breath. But what if there's something that continues beyond those thresholds? Not in a mystical way, but in a way we just don't have the tools to measure yet. Last winter I went back to St. Helena. The crematorium had been shut down, replaced by a new automated facility across town. The old building was empty, stripped of machinery, filled only with dust and echoes. I walked down the corridor to the chamber room, my footsteps soft against the cold floor. The furnace door, the same one from that night, stood open, rusted around the hinges. I don't know why I did it, but I whispered an apology into the still air. Not out of guilt, but respect. For the unknown, for the possibility that somewhere between breath and silence, something of us remains. When I left, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The hum I once feared so much was gone. What stayed instead was a kind of peace. Quiet, uneasy, but real. I'll never know what truly happened that night. Maybe I don't need to. Maybe some things aren't meant to be explained, only remembered. And even now, when the world goes still, I sometimes feel the air shift. Soft, familiar, as if the silence itself remembers me too.